The first lie did not sound like gunfire or breaking glass. It sounded like a woman screaming rape in a quiet Florida town where every white man already believed a black body was a loaded weapon. And that scream would wipe an entire community off the map. On the morning of January 1st, 1923, the sun rose over two different worlds that shared the same patch of North Florida soil. In Sumner, a shabby sawmill town of white workers and unpainted houses, men nursed hangovers from New Year's whiskey and argued about wages, lumber, and the problem of black veterans who had come back from Europe walking too tall. A few miles away, in the tiny community of Rosewood, black families woke up in wooden homes they owned, walked land they had bought, and looked out at a future that, at least on the surface, seemed safer than anything their parents had known. By the end of that week, one woman's lie, amplified by white fear and white rage, would erase one of those worlds almost completely. Rosewood did not look like the kind of place that was supposed to exist in Jim Crow Florida. It was a predominantly black town in Levy County, tucked among pine forests and dirt roads, with a population that hovered around 200. Families had built simple but solid houses with porches and fireplaces, planted gardens, and fenced-off chicken yards. There was a church with white clapboard walls, a school for black children, and a few small businesses. A general store, a turpentine still, a barber, a midwife who delivered babies for miles around. People worked hard, mostly in the timber and turpentine industries. But what set Rosewood apart was ownership. Many of the men and women there owned their homes outright. For a black family in the Deep South in the 1920s, that was a kind of quiet revolution. The town also had something else that made white men in surrounding communities uneasy: veterans. Several of Rosewood's young men had gone overseas with the U.S. Army during World War I. They had seen France. They had worn American uniforms, carried rifles stamped U.S., and watched white officers bleed and die like any other man. Overseas, some had been saluted, paid on time, even treated as heroes. For a while. Coming home to Florida, they were ordered back into the old script. Step off the sidewalk for white women, avert their eyes, say, "Yes, sir," to men who had never seen a battlefield. But once you have fought in a trench, it is hard to truly believe that a clerk or a sawmill foreman is your superior because of his skin. That quiet refusal to shrink back was written in their posture, in the way they looked people in the eye. White men noticed. One of those veterans was Sylvester Carrier. In Rosewood, he was known as a proud, serious man with a sharp mind and a shorter temper than most. He played piano at the church and was fiercely protective of his family, especially his mother, Sarah Carrier, a former teacher whose word still carried weight among the town's elders. Sylvester owned guns, knew how to use them, and did not make a secret of either fact. In a state where lynch mobs could assemble in minutes over an accusation, his existence was both a comfort to his neighbors and an insult to white supremacy. Sumner, by contrast, was almost entirely white and rough. Its economy revolved around one sawmill and the white men who worked there, many of them poor, angry, and convinced that the thin line between them and poverty was the ability to assert their dominance over someone else. They lived in small company houses, drank in makeshift bars, and told stories about uppity Negroes who needed to be reminded of their place. The Ku Klux Klan was not just a rumor in this region. It marched openly, burning crosses, holding rallies, and making it clear that violence was a tool always ready to be used. In this atmosphere, a white woman's word could function like a loaded gun. That woman was Fannie Taylor. Fannie was young, attractive, and married to James Taylor, a white worker at the sawmill in Sumner. Their house sat near the mill, close enough that the constant scream of saws and the smell of fresh-cut boards seeped into everything. From the outside, their life looked respectable, a working-class white couple in a town that saw itself as the backbone of real America. Behind closed doors, things were different. Rumors circulated quietly that a white man who was not her husband sometimes visited Fannie when James was at work. Men who noticed a stranger slipping in or out learned quickly to keep those observations to themselves. In Jim Crow, Florida, there were things you did not say out loud if you wanted to keep your teeth. On the morning of January 1st, 1923, the neighbors heard Fannie scream. The sound cut through the thin walls of the Taylor house and spilled into the street. High, panicked, insistent. A few seconds later, a door slammed. When people rushed over, they found Fannie bruised and hysterical, claiming that a black man had entered her home and attacked her. She was vague on details, saying she had been beaten, possibly assaulted, and that the man had run. She never used the word affair. She never mentioned any white lover. The story hardened with each retelling. A black man had tried to rape a white woman. In the racial logic of the day, nothing else really mattered. There was a problem, though. One Fannie could not erase as easily as she hid her secrets. A black man who had actually assaulted a white woman in a small town like Sumner would have been dead within an hour, shot or lynched by an impromptu mob. But there was no dead black man in Fannie's house, no body in the yard, no blood trail into the woods. Whoever had beaten her was gone, and she needed a way to explain both the injuries and the absence. The easiest solution was to give the town something it wanted anyway: a black suspect to hunt. Within hours, the story had changed again. It was no longer a black man. It was a specific black man. Jesse Hunter, an African-American prisoner who had recently escaped from a chain gang in the area. Law enforcement had already been searching for him. Now, with Fannie's accusation, he became the perfect scapegoat. In the minds of angry white men eager for action, the narrative snapped into place. An escaped black convict had attacked a white woman and fled. There was no proof. There were no witnesses. But there was a white woman's word, and for them, that outranked evidence. Sheriff Robert Walker of Levy County was called. On paper, he was the law. In practice, he was a man caught between the demands of procedure and the violent impatience of his own neighbors. In that place and time, sheriffs did not simply enforce the law. They negotiated with mobs, directed them, or all too often, quietly stepped aside to let them do what they wanted. Walker organized a search party supposedly to find Jesse Hunter. But the men who gathered, armed with rifles, pistols, shotguns, and dogs, were not thinking about a careful investigation. They were thinking about vengeance. And when white men in a mob think about vengeance in the Deep South of 1923, the target is rarely a single individual. It did not take long for the mob's attention to drift from Jesse Hunter to Rosewood. Rosewood was close, black, and independent. To white men in Sumner, it represented everything that felt like a threat in 1923. Black landowners, black veterans, black families who did not visibly cower. When some claimed they had seen a suspicious Negro running in that direction, it was all the excuse they needed. In their minds, the hunt for Jesse Hunter merged seamlessly with something deeper and uglier, a desire to reassert dominance over an entire community that had dared to stand upright. The first step in that process was interrogation. The mob needed a guide, someone black who might know where an escaped man could hide. They focused on a name: Sam Carter. Sam Carter was a respected black blacksmith who lived near Rosewood and often worked for both black and white customers. He was known as skilled with metal, strong, and careful. That made him valuable and vulnerable. On the afternoon of January 1st, white men confronted Carter, demanding information about Jesse Hunter. Whether Sam actually knew anything about Hunter's whereabouts is still debated. What matters is that the mob decided he did. They seized him, beat him, and forced him to lead them to somewhere, anywhere, that could be called a hiding place. Under a tree in the woods, not far from the road, the interrogation turned into an execution. The white men tied Sam Carter up, continued to question him, and when his answers did not satisfy them, they shot him. Some accounts say he was hanged first and then shot, his body riddled with bullets as a warning. The details differ, but one fact does not. A black man who had done nothing more than work metal and live his life was now dead, because a white woman needed a lie and a mob needed blood. Word of Carter's lynching moved faster than any official report. News traveled along invisible lines, between women drawing water at wells, between men loading wagons, between children sent to run and tell their elders. By nightfall, Rosewood knew something terrible had shifted. A white woman in Sumner had accused a black man. A white mob had formed. A black neighbor was already dead. And the men in that mob were not going home satisfied. They were still armed. They were still angry. And in their minds, there was still a debt to be paid. In the Carrier house in Rosewood, Sarah listened to the rumors with a face carved from stone. She had heard variations of this story her entire life. A white grievance, a black suspect, a sheriff who could not, or would not, restrain the crowd. Her son Sylvester oiled his rifle in silence, the metal of the bolt smooth under his hands, his jaw clenched. Somewhere between Sumner and Rosewood, in the shadows of the pine forest, men with guns and torches were moving, their steps guided not by evidence or reason, but by a lie that had just been promoted to truth. What no one in Rosewood knew yet was that this was not going to be a single night of terror. It was the opening move in a week-long campaign that would test every rule they had been taught about survival under Jim Crow. The white men coming toward them were not hunting one escaped prisoner anymore. They were coming for a town. The first shot did not come from the white mob outside. It came from inside Sarah Carrier's house, fired by her son, a black World War I veteran who decided that if death was coming to Rosewood, it would have to walk through his doorway, under fire. By the evening of January 4th, 1923, Sarah Carrier's small wooden house had become the most dangerous place in Rosewood, and the safest. It was dangerous because every white man in Sumner now believed the troublemakers were inside it. It was safe because the people hiding there were under the protection of a man who had already survived one war and was prepared, with grim clarity, to fight another. The day had started with rumors and ended with a strategy. After the lynching of Sam Carter and the first wave of threats, black families in Rosewood began to make choices no one should ever have to make. Some packed what they could carry and disappeared into the surrounding swamps, hoping the thick trees and murky water would hide them. Others went to the house of the one woman everyone trusted to keep her head when the world around her was losing theirs, Sarah Carrier. Sarah was not a large woman, but she carried herself with the authority of someone who had spent her life insisting on dignity in a world designed to strip it away. She had once worked in the home of a white family, the Taylors, cleaning and cooking for wages that never matched the effort she put in. She knew the texture of white rage and white fear up close. She understood that the lie told in Sumner would not stay there. And she knew that if anyone in her community was going to survive the coming nights, they would need more than prayer. They would need a plan. Her house sat near the center of Rosewood, modest but sturdy. 2 rooms, a front porch, a small yard, a stove that always seemed to have a pot simmering on it. That day, as the sun slid low and shadows stretched across the dirt road, her house turned into a refuge. Women arrived clutching children, eyes wide with the shock of having to flee their own homes. Older men, too frail to run into the woods, came leaning on canes. A few teenage boys, too young to have fought in Europe but old enough to feel the hum of anger in their veins, slipped in quietly with whatever weapons they could find. Pistols, shotguns, even knives wrapped in cloth. Sylvester Carrier stood at the window as they arrived, watching, counting, making mental notes. Each new face sharpened his sense of responsibility. These weren't abstract citizens. These were people he had grown up with. Women who had bandaged his knees when he fell as a boy. Men who had taught him how to fish, how to plant. Children whose parents trusted him enough to put their lives, and the lives of their babies, in his hands. War had taught him that defense was not just about courage. It was about preparation. He and his younger brother Willie began to turn Sarah's home into a fortress, as much as a small wooden house could be. They checked every window, gauging sight lines, angles, and fields of fire the way Sylvester had once assessed trenches and shell holes in France. The front door was reinforced with whatever furniture they could move: chairs, a heavy table, a wardrobe dragged across the floor with a grinding sound that made the children flinch. The windows were left partly open, not for air, but for rifles. There were 3 guns inside the Carrier house that night that truly mattered. Sylvester's Springfield rifle, brought back from the war, a pump-action shotgun, and a pistol with a stiff trigger. Ammunition was limited. Every bullet would have to count. Sylvester explained it in simple, hard sentences to the men and older boys who could shoot. "We do not waste rounds," he said. "You see a body, not a shadow. You see a man with a gun, not someone running. If you don't know what you're looking at, you don't fire." Sarah listened, arms folded. She did not argue with her son. She understood that his experience in France gave him a kind of authority here. But while Sylvester prepared for a military engagement, Sarah prepared for something just as important: the endurance of the people inside. She moved among the women and children, speaking in a low, steady voice. She told them where to sit, to stay below window level. She showed the older children how to comfort the younger ones without making noise, how to press a small hand over a trembling mouth, how to wrap arms gently but firmly around a shaking body. She divided what food was on hand into small portions, not because anyone was hungry now, but because she knew that when fear finally loosened its grip, stomachs would clench with need. Outside, the soundscape was changing. For most of that day, Rosewood had been filled with the ordinary noise of a rural black town: chickens, wagons, voices. As the sun went down, those noises thinned and died. In their place came something else: the distant rumble of engines, the crunch of tires and boots on dirt, the disjointed shouts of men who had been drinking and wanted to feel brave together. The mob was gathering. They did not come all at once like a wave. They came in clusters: cars and trucks from Sumner, from nearby towns, from farms whose white owners had heard that they'd finally got reason to whip those Rosewood Negroes into line. Some wore their everyday clothes. Others wore pieces of old uniforms, bandanas, or even white hoods. Guns hung from shoulders, glinted in hands. The crowd was not yet the hundreds it would become, but it was already more men than any house should have to face. At the edge of town, some of the older black men of Rosewood watched from the shadows of trees, making their own grim calculations. They knew that staying in their homes would not save them. They also knew that firing the first shot at a white mob had consequences that echoed far beyond a single night. For generations, they had been taught one rule above all: do not give white men an excuse. Tonight, that rule was collapsing under the weight of reality. The mob did not need an excuse. It already had one: a lie polished into righteousness. The first approach to the Carrier house was almost casual. A small group of white men walked up the road, rifles on their shoulders, acting as if they were simply out for a stroll. One carried a lantern, its light bobbing. They stopped outside the house, close enough to see the faint movement behind the curtains, close enough to smell the fear and sweat inside. One of them, a man whose voice carried like he was used to shouting orders, called out, "Sarah, we know you in there. Send them boys out now. We just want to talk to Sylvester." His tone pretended at reason, but everyone inside the house heard the lie. Sylvester stood where he could see the speaker through a gap in the curtain. He recognized the man from Sumner, a foreman, someone who had always talked to black men like they were children. Behind him, in the darkness beyond the lantern's glow, Sylvester counted shapes. 5, maybe 6. He knew there would be more hanging back, waiting to see how this first contact went. Sarah's hand brushed her son's arm. "Don't answer," she whispered. But silence is an answer too. The men outside took it as defiance. "All right then," the leader called. "You want to do it the hard way? We can do the hard way. But when it starts, ain't no stopping it." He stepped closer to the porch, lifting the lantern as if he might try the door himself, test the handle, peer inside. For a moment, everything hung on a thin line, on the question of who would make the first irrevocable move. Sylvester watched his silhouette grow bigger in the window frame. He thought of France, of German soldiers advancing through a foggy field, of the lectures he'd heard about when you hold your fire and when you don't. He thought of Sam Carter's broken body hanging from a tree. He thought of the children behind him, pressed against their mother's skirts. The rifle was steady in his hands when he pulled the trigger. The shot shattered the night. The lantern exploded in a burst of glass and flame as the man holding it jerked backward, struck in the chest. For a second, the fire painted his falling body in terrible clarity. Then the lantern hit the ground, rolled, and went out, plunging the scene into darkness and chaos. Outside, men shouted, cursed, dove for cover. A second shot rang from inside the house, then a third. At least one more white man went down, hit by bullets fired through the window gaps Sylvester had chosen hours earlier. The mob had expected intimidation, a surrender, maybe a desperate flight out the back door. They had not expected disciplined, accurate fire from a black man who understood exactly what he was doing. The illusion of control evaporated. In its place came blind rage. Gunfire erupted from outside, wild at first, men shooting at windows, at walls, at the shape of the house itself. Glass shattered. Wood splintered. Bullets tore through the thin boards, sending splinters flying across the crowded room. Children screamed until their mothers' hands covered their mouths. The air filled with the acrid stench of gunpowder and the fine dust of shattered plaster. Inside, Sylvester did what soldiers do under fire. He moved. Between shots, he shifted along the wall, never staying at the same window twice, forcing the men outside to fire at ghosts. Willie passed him ammunition with shaking hands. Another man took the shotgun and focused on the doorway, ready in case the mob tried to rush it. Sarah, in the middle of the chaos, became the axis the room turned around. She did not pick up a gun. She picked up people. "Get down," she ordered the women and children. "Stay away from the walls. Crawl if you have to, don't stand. Breathe. We ain't dead yet." Her voice cut through the thunder of gunfire like a bell. People obeyed. Bodies pressed low, heads ducked. A little girl whose scream had climbed into a high, keening pitch found herself pulled against Sarah's chest, her face pressed into the older woman's dress until the sound became muffled sobs. The exchange of fire did not last hours. It only felt that way. In reality, the first intense volley from both sides burned out in minutes as ammunition and adrenaline began to run low. The men outside pulled back, dragging their wounded, leaving at least 2 bodies where they'd fallen in the road. From behind the broken windows, Sylvester could hear them regrouping, voices rough with shock. "They shot us! Those damn niggers shot us!" The word traveled down the line of men like a spark through dry grass. Shot us. Not resisted, not fought back. Shot us. In the twisted racial logic of the moment, what had just happened was not self-defense. It was rebellion. And rebellion, in their minds, warranted annihilation. They would not rush the house again that night. Fear restrained them as much as anger pushed them forward. Men who had always imagined black people as permanent victims now had to step over the bodies of their own dead, killed by someone they considered inferior. Their next move was not a headlong charge. It was escalation. "We go get more men," someone shouted. "We ain't letting this stand. We'll burn 'em out if we have to." The sound of engines starting, of vehicles turning around in the road, drifted to the carrier house, alongside the smell of smoke from one of the first fires lit that night in Rosewood. Another house, somewhere else, already burning. Inside, the silence after the gunfire was almost as loud as the bullets had been. Ears rang, hands shook. Someone began to pray out loud, voice trembling. In the dim light of a single lamp turned down low, Sylvester's face looked carved from stone. But his eyes betrayed the toll. He had killed men tonight. He knew what that meant, both morally and practically. There would be no going back to the way things were. Not for him. Not for Rosewood. He checked his rifle again, counting the rounds left. "They'll be back," he said quietly. "And next time, they won't come in 10s. They'll come in 100s. Sarah looked around the room at the women, the children, the old men who could hardly stand. She saw exhaustion, terror, and something else, a hard, glittering line of resolve. "Then we decide now," she said. "Who stays, who goes, and who lives to tell what they done here?" Outside, the night gathered itself like a fist. The siege of Sarah Carrier's house had begun, and with it, the transformation of Rosewood from a quiet black town into a battlefield whose name the state of Florida would spend 70 years trying to forget. They did not just come back with more men. They came back with more men, more guns, and, for the first time in American history, against its own citizens on home soil, airplanes circling overhead, prepared to burn a black town off the map from the sky. By the morning of January 5, 1923, Rosewood was no longer a frightened community waiting for trouble. It was an active war zone. The first night of gunfire at Sarah Carrier's house had broken an invisible barrier. A black man had killed white men in armed self-defense, and the white South did not have a script for that outcome that ended with restraint. The news traveled fast and ugly. In Sumner's bars and boarding houses, the story twisted with each retelling. "They shot one of ours" became "they murdered us in cold blood." "We tried to bring them in" became "we gave them a chance and they chose war." Men who hadn't been anywhere near Sarah Carrier's house spoke with shaking outrage about ambush and savagery. The dead white men were no longer individuals with personal histories and bad decisions. They had become martyrs, and martyrs demand vengeance. Cars and trucks began arriving from farther away. Levy County was poor, but white solidarity traveled easily along its dirt roads. From Cedar Key, from Bronson, from Archer and beyond, men came with rifles slung across their backs, shotguns resting in the beds of their trucks, pistols tucked into belts. Some wore pieces of their old World War I uniforms, as if to remind themselves and everyone else that they had once been part of a disciplined, uniformed killing machine, and that they knew how to bring that machine's logic home. At first, there was still a veneer of a search. They spoke about looking for Jesse Hunter, the escaped convict who had become the ghost at the center of Fannie Taylor's lie. But as the crowd swelled into the hundreds, the language shifted. They were no longer after a man. They were after those Rosewood niggers. The specific name, Jesse Hunter, faded like smoke. The targets multiplied. On the road into Rosewood, small clusters of black families could already be seen slipping into the woods, carrying whatever they could hold. Bundles of clothes, sacks of food, babies wrapped in quilts. They had heard the gunfire. They had seen smoke columning up from at least one burning house. They knew the shape of white violence. Some did not even try to lock their doors behind them. What was the use of a wooden latch against a mob? John Wright, one of the few white residents of Rosewood, stood on the porch of his general store and watched the line of vehicles like a man watching an oncoming storm he knew could not be diverted. He was not a saint. He benefited from the same racial hierarchy as every white man in Levy County. But he had lived among Rosewood's black families long enough to see their humanity up close. He had sold them flour and sugar, bought their turpentine and lumber, listened to their stories. Now, as the white militia grew, he understood with a sinking clarity that the people he knew as neighbors were about to be treated like enemy combatants, or worse, like vermin. At the Carrier house, the night had been long and thin. Sleep came in shreds, if it came at all. Children woke, screaming from dreams that were barely worse than the reality around them. The older men had taken turns at the broken windows, watching for movement, listening for engines. Sylvester had not slept. His eyes were red-rimmed, his hands raw from loading and reloading the Springfield. When the first light seeped over the pines, it did not bring relief. It brought visibility for them and for the men coming to kill them. Sarah moved stiffly through the cramped rooms, her back aching, but her movements deliberate. She pressed water cups into small hands, tied headscarves tighter around women's hair, murmured the same phrase again and again like a lifeline. We ain't dead yet. Long as we ain't dead, we got choices. Those choices narrowed by the minute. The first wave that morning did not go straight for the carrier house. It went for the town. White men fanned out through Rosewood's grid of dirt streets and scattered homes, knocking down doors with the butts of their rifles, shouting for black residents to come out. Some houses were empty already, their inhabitants gone into the swamp in the dark hours before dawn. Others still held people who had not believed, until it was too late, that the worst could happen here. In house after house, scenes unfolded that would replay themselves for decades in the survivors' minds. A mother forced at gunpoint to step outside while her children cried behind her. An old man beaten for not moving fast enough. A teen boy struck in the face because his eyes did not drop quickly enough from a white man's direct stare. Sometimes the violence stopped at intimidation. Too often, it escalated. Doors were set on fire to smoke 'em out. Shots were fired into windows just in case someone was hiding. The line between search and destruction blurred instantly. By midday, the smoke was no longer isolated. It rose in multiple pillars, gray-black against the winter sky, marking homes that had stood for years, and now were nothing more than frames and embers. The mob's confidence grew with each fire. They told themselves that they were cleaning out a nest, that each house burned was a blow for white safety, for white womanhood, for some abstract idea of order. But the carrier house still stood, full of people and, worse in their eyes, full of defiance. The stories had already spread among the men regrouping near the edge of town. They got a sniper in there. He shot 2 of ours like they was Germans. They bunkered down like they overseas. Some laughed nervously, trying to push away the recognition that war had, in fact, come home with them, and that this time they were not the only ones who knew how to fight it. It was at this point that someone suggested something new. Among the men in the growing militia were a few who had flown or worked around the small planes that had become more common in Florida after the war. They were not bombers in the sense of European battlefields, but they could carry weight, sandbags, crates, or if someone chose, makeshift incendiary devices. An idea that would have been unthinkable in another context took shape in the overheated, alcohol-fueled conversations of that day. If they could not easily storm a fortified house without more casualties, they could make that house and the entire town uninhabitable. "Flush 'em out," one man said, gesturing upward. "Smoke 'em, burn 'em, drive 'em into the open. Then they ain't so brave." Whether the decision was made by a single leader or emerged organically from the crowd hardly mattered. Within hours, the soft drone of engines joined the crack of rifle fire and the roar of flames. Airplanes, small, single-engine craft, circled above Rosewood like hawks. To the people on the ground, especially the children who had never seen a plane up close before, the sight was surreal. In France, Sylvester had watched German spotter planes and Allied fighters slicing through the sky. Here, in rural Florida, that same technology now hovered over his mother's house. From those planes fell not precision bombs, but something cruder and no less horrifying. Containers of fuel and crude explosives aimed with hateful care at the clusters of black homes still standing. When they hit, the effect was less like a military strike and more like a series of man-made lightning bolts. Sudden eruptions of fire where moments before there had been wood and shingle. The forest around Rosewood had always been a source of life, timber for building, game for hunting, a place to gather herbs and firewood. Now it became an accomplice to destruction. Dry pine needles and wooden roofs caught fire with awful eagerness. Flames jumped from one structure to another, turning yards into corridors of heat. The sound of the planes overhead fused with the crackle and roar of burning buildings, until it felt, to those hiding inside, like the very sky was on fire. In the carrier house, smoke seeped through the cracks, even before any visible flame appeared nearby. The children coughed, their eyes watering. Sarah moved to wet rags and pressed them over small mouths and noses, the way older women had taught her to do during brush fires and stove accidents. But this was larger, hotter, and driven by intent rather than accident. Sylvester watched the planes through the jagged fragment of window pane that remained. Every pass they made tightened the vise. The message was clear. You are surrounded. From the road, from the fields, and now from the air. You will not simply be shot. You will be erased. The men outside, emboldened by the destruction, moved closer again. This time, they were not content to trade shots with an unseen defender. As homes continued to burn and black families fled screaming into the woods, a core group of white men advanced on the carrier house with a different swagger. They had felt fear the night before when their friends fell. Now they had fire and numbers on their side. But for all their rage, there was still an edge of caution in their steps. They approached from angles Sylvester could not entirely cover, keeping low, using trees and outbuildings as partial shields. A few tried to circle behind, assuming that anyone inside would be too focused on the road-facing windows to notice a rear assault. They were not entirely wrong. You cannot watch every direction at once when you have so few defenders. Shots rang out again, but this time the exchange was more uneven. The white men were learning, adapting, firing from cover, coordinating their volleys. Each bullet that slammed into the house now punched through wood, weakened by heat and smoke. Inside, pieces of plaster rained down, a mirror shattered, spraying glass. A child screamed as a splinter tore their arm, the bright red of blood startling against already smoke-darkened skin. "Down!" Sylvester roared, even though most of them already were. He fired, once, twice, 3 times, targeting the flashes of muzzle fire and the flicker of movement he could pick out between the trunks. One of the men outside, a younger one, face still smooth under the brim of his hat, jerked backward and went down, his rifle spinning out of his hands. Another cursed, clutching his shoulder. Each impact reignited the mob's fury, but also deepened its sense of this house as a cursed, deadly place. The idea of simply rushing the door with raw numbers still did not feel safe. It was not brute courage that shifted the balance. It was a series of smaller, quieter decisions made elsewhere in Rosewood. Some of the women sheltering in the carrier house looked at the children and realized that staying meant consigning them to either bullets or burned lungs. The swamp, for all its dangers, started to look like a better option. If they could move now, in the confusion of renewed gunfire and spreading smoke, they might slip away into the trees before the noose tightened completely. Sarah saw it in their eyes. The calculation, the terror, the terrible hope. "They ain't gonna stop," she said, her voice ragged but clear. "Not today. Maybe not tomorrow. This house is where they think the fight is. Let that be what it is. But some of you got to get these babies out now, before that fire reach us, before they ring this place in iron. There are moments when leadership looks like standing firm with a gun in your hand. There are other moments when it looks like telling people to run and not look back." Sarah did both. With brutal efficiency, she and a few others organized a split. The oldest, and those too weak to move fast, would stay in the house under Sylvester's protection for as long as it could hold. The women and children who could move quietly would slip out the back in small groups, using the smoke as cover, heading toward the wetlands and thick woods that had already swallowed dozens of their neighbors. The decision felt like tearing her own body in half, but Sarah did not flinch. She hugged each child quickly, whispered instructions into each woman's ear, which direction to head, whom to look for, how to listen for friendly voices, and avoid white ones. The back door, long barred, was eased open with agonizing slowness, every creak of its hinges sounding to them like a shout. Outside that door, the world was a different kind of battlefield. Smoke hung low. Embers fluttered through the air like malicious fireflies. The roar from the front of the house, the shots, the shouts, covered the faint sound of bare feet on packed earth. One by one, bent low, the first group slipped into the gray air and were gone, swallowed by the trees beyond the yard. Inside, the odd quiet their departure left behind was filled almost immediately by something else. The shrill whistle of another incoming incendiary, the slam of something hitting a nearby structure, the whoosh of ignition. Heat pressed against the walls like an approaching hand. Sylvester glanced back once, just long enough to confirm that his mother was still there, that the core of the house's defense had not dissolved with the exodus. Her eyes met his, full of fire of their own. "Make 'em pay for every step," she said. He nodded and turned back to the window, where the shapes of armed men moved against a backdrop of his burning town. Rosewood was dying around them, house by house, tree by tree, memory by memory. From the sky, from the road, from the edge of the swamp, white power was doing more than punishing a crime that had never occurred. It was attempting to send a message so loud that no black community in Florida would dare to stand tall again. What the men with guns and planes failed to understand was that some messages cut in two directions. The survivors stumbling through smoke toward the swamps were not just running. They were carrying with them something that could not be burned. The knowledge of exactly what had been done here and to whom. For now, though, the question inside the carrier house was simpler and more immediate. How long could one small, smoke-filled, bullet-torn home stand against a mob that now had the power of the ground and the sky on its side? They did not bury Rosewood in a cemetery. They buried it in paperwork, silence, and fear, then spent 71 years pretending the town had never existed, until one old woman broke the spell by finally saying, on the record, what she had seen as a terrified little girl. In the weeks after the fires went out and the gunfire stopped, what remained of Rosewood was not a town. It was a scar. Charred foundations and blackened chimneys jutted from the earth like broken teeth. The air, for a time, still carried the ghost of burned wood and flesh. But the most deliberate destruction did not happen with flames. It happened with decisions made in offices, on porches, and around dinner tables. Decisions about what would and would not be spoken aloud. The official story that settled over Levy County like a dirty blanket was simple and false. There had been trouble. Negroes had got out of hand. There had been a riot, a disturbance, a race clash. Words that suggested two equal sides, two matching forces, meeting in unfortunate but mutual violence. Missing from that story were the plains, the lynchings, the systematic burning of homes, the hunted women and children stumbling barefoot through swamps. For the white men who had taken part in the massacre, silence served several purposes. It protected them from the faint possibility of legal consequences. It shielded them from the discomfort of naming what they had actually done, hunting neighbors, killing unarmed people, burning property that did not belong to them. It also preserved the illusion they needed to live with themselves, that this had been necessary, justified, even heroic. Lawmen cooperated in the burial. No serious investigation followed. No grand jury convened to ask why an entire black town had vanished in a week. Death certificates, where they existed, were vague. Many bodies were never officially recorded at all, swallowed by unmarked graves beneath pine roots and weeds. The state of Florida, on paper, moved on as if Rosewood had been erased by some natural disaster rather than an organized, racially targeted attack. For the black survivors, silence was not a luxury. It was a condition of staying alive. Those who had escaped through the swamps scattered across Florida and beyond. Some went to Gainesville, others to Jacksonville, Ocala, Miami. Many took whatever work they could find: maids, laborers, porters, cooks. They changed their addresses, then their routines, and in some cases even their names. If they spoke of Rosewood at all, it was in family whispers, late at night, when doors were bolted and children were half asleep. The children who had crouched on the floors of burning houses or run through freezing marsh water carrying younger siblings grew up with nightmares they could not explain to outsiders. When classmates asked, "Where are you from?" they answered with the name of the city they'd landed in, not the town that had been taken from them. Teachers never mentioned Rosewood in lessons about Florida history. Newspapers that had once printed phrases like, "a cargo of choice, healthy slaves," now printed weather and crop prices, without a single line about the town that no longer appeared on any map. Parents made bargains with themselves about how much to tell their own children. Some chose a near-total blackout, hoping that ignorance would function as protection. Others shared fragments. We had to leave home fast. White folks did us bad back then, but left out names, dates, and the full monstrous specifics. They had learned the hard way that information could be a liability. A child who talked too freely at school about what had happened might bring dangerous attention back onto the family. In this way, a strange, split reality developed. On the surface, the story of Rosewood all but vanished. Underneath, within certain bloodlines, it pulsed like a hidden vein. Grandmothers remembered which houses had stood where. Uncles remembered who had refused to leave, who had disappeared, who had been last seen at Sarah Carrier's door. Cousins learned not to ask why their elders sometimes went quiet at the mention of Levy County. The state itself benefited from that enforced amnesia. Florida sold itself to the rest of the country as sunshine and oranges, beaches, and tourism. Brochures did not mention that in 1923, the same government now promising relaxation and leisure had done nothing while an entire black community was wiped out. Economic growth depended on a certain kind of story, and Rosewood did not fit. Decades passed. The survivors aged. By the 1970s and early 1980s, many of the people who had been children in Rosewood were now elders, with failing eyesight, arthritic hands, and hearts that carried 7 decades of bottled grief. The country around them had changed. The civil rights movement had shaken the legal foundations of Jim Crow. Schools were, at least on paper, desegregated. Black politicians were being elected in some places. But in Florida, the name Rosewood still conjured, at most, a vague memory of some trouble back then among white residents, and nothing at all among younger generations. It might have stayed that way if not for the persistence of small, stubborn questions. Every buried secret eventually leaks at the edges. A casual comment from an older relative, a half-finished sentence cut off by a sharp, "Hush, child." A family that refuses, generation after generation, to drive through a particular county. These oddities accumulate. For one journalist in the early 1980s, they became a trail. He had heard the name Rosewood in passing during a conversation about racial violence in the South. When he tried to look it up, he found almost nothing. No books, no detailed articles, just a few dry mentions in old papers that spoke more about unrest than massacre. For a reporter trained to notice absence as much as presence, that void was an alarm. If a whole town had burned and almost no one had written about it, something was being hidden. Finding the survivors was not easy. Phone directories were useless when people had scattered and changed names. Records from 1923 were incomplete by design. But persistence intersected with memory. One name led to another. An elderly woman in a modest home in Florida agreed finally to talk. Her name was Minnie Lee, though the reporter first knew her as an entry on a list of people who might know something. When he arrived at her house, she was in her 70s. Her hands shook slightly as she poured coffee, but her voice, once she began, did not. She had been a small child in Sarah Carrier's house when the mob surrounded it. She remembered noises more than faces, the deafening blast of gunfire, the shattering of glass, the way her own heartbeat sounded in her ears as she tried to make her small body even smaller beneath her mother's arms. She remembered being hustled out a back door, the feel of cold air on her face, the harsh branches of scrub and pine scraping her legs as they ran. She remembered the smell of smoke, so thick she thought it might choke the sky itself. For decades, those memories had been private ghosts. Now, sitting in a room with a tape recorder running, she spoke them into the world. Her words did not just travel to one listener. They entered an archive of facts that the state could no longer plausibly deny. Once the dam cracked, more stories flowed. Other survivors, emboldened by the knowledge that they were not alone, agreed to interviews. They compared recollections, argued over certain details, but aligned on the core truth. White men had come, killed, burned, and driven them from homes they had owned. The pretext, a supposed attack on a white woman, had been false or wildly exaggerated. The response had been not justice, but collective punishment aimed at black existence itself. Under pressure from journalists, activists, and black legislators, Florida did something it had never done before in relation to Rosewood. It authorized an official investigation. A state-appointed commission began reviewing whatever records still existed from 1923. Newspaper articles, property deeds, court logs, tax rolls. They interviewed surviving witnesses, both black and white. Some white elders, now at the end of their lives, admitted pieces of the truth they had never publicly spoken. Seeing houses burn, hearing shots, watching neighbors disappear. Most still framed it in the language of the time. Things got out of hand. There was a misunderstanding. The Negroes was riled up. But between their hedges and evasions, the outline of deliberate, targeted slaughter emerged. For the Commission, the evidence presented an uncomfortable question. If a state had failed so completely to protect its black citizens in 1923, did it have any responsibility, 70 years later, to do more than shrug? The survivors and their descendants thought it did. They filed a claim for compensation, not just for emotional pain, but for concrete economic loss. Rosewood had not been a random collection of shacks. It had been a community with land deeds, houses, businesses. When those were destroyed, families lost not only shelter, but generational wealth. Equity that could have been passed down, used to educate children, build businesses, and secure better futures. Opponents of the compensation bill argued that it was too late, too hard to calculate, too dangerous a precedent. If Florida admitted legal responsibility for Rosewood, what else might people demand repayment for? How far back could one go in history to balance old accounts? Underneath those objections simmered a more basic resistance. The unwillingness of a state built on racial hierarchy to formally confess that it had, at best, looked away while a black town was erased. In 1994, after bitter debates and emotional testimony, the Florida legislature passed what became known as the Rosewood Compensation Bill. It did not rebuild the town. It did not bring back the dead. But it did something unprecedented. It acknowledged, in the language of law, that what had happened in 1923 was a racially motivated massacre, and that the state had failed to protect its citizens. The bill allocated several $1 million in total. Surviving victims received direct payments. Descendants received scholarships. The numbers on the checks could never equal the value of lost lives or homes, but they were tangible, and tangibility matters. On paper, in budgets and statutes, Rosewood now existed again, not as a rumor, but as a wrong that the state itself named and tried, however inadequately, to address. In the years that followed, a small monument was erected near the site where Rosewood had stood. Historical markers went up along the road, telling passing drivers in simple text that a black town had once lived here and had been destroyed by racial violence. School curricula in Florida began, slowly, to include Rosewood in lessons on state history. None of this brought peace to everyone. Some survivors and descendants felt a measure of vindication. Others saw the compensation as a bandage over a wound that still burned. Among white residents, reactions were similarly divided. Some expressed shame and regret. Others resented the bill, insisting that what's past is past, and that they bore no responsibility for their grandfather's actions. But whether people agreed with it or not, the silence was broken. The story of Rosewood, its quiet prosperity, its sudden destruction, its long burial in fear and denial, and its partial resurrection through testimony and law, now lives in a space that cannot easily be burned or bulldozed. It lives in archives, in books, in documentaries, and in the memories of grandchildren who grew up hearing, finally, the full version of Where Our People Came From. For a week in January 1923, the men with guns and torches and planes believed they were erasing a problem. They burned houses, bodies, and records, certain that fire and fear could finish the job. They did not count on the stubbornness of memory, or on the possibility that one day, a little girl who crawled out of a death house in the smoke would grow old, sit down in front of a microphone and say, clearly and calmly, "This is what they did. This is what I saw. And you will not pretend it never happened."